Well, welcome back, everyone. Let's settle in. Can you hear us okay? I think the mics are on. Good. Now we've got the grand finale now. I'm going to talk about translations of the Constitution. These are not Lessig translations. These are actual translations. And our speaker on this subject, Christina Mulligan, and then some commentary from Jack Balkin. Thank you, Christina.
Right. So here we are at the end of the day. It's pretty rare these days to find a truly untapped source of constitutional meaning from the founding era, but that's what these the German and Dutch founding era translations of the Constitution turned out to be. So in these next 10 minutes, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the history and the context of these translations, talk about what we can learn from them in terms of understanding our original English Constitution, our English language Constitution, perhaps is more a precise way of saying it, and then go into some of the more interesting particulars in those translations. So after the Philadelphia Convention, the Pennsylvania legislature met and decided to make copies of the Constitution in English and in German for the German-speaking population of Pennsylvania, which at the time comprised about a third of the population of Pennsylvania. So the legislature commissioned a group of three individuals in the legislature to choose someone to render the translation. And as best we can tell, it's not known who that person actually was who made the translation. It was printed by Michael Billmeyer, disseminated throughout Pennsylvania, and that's mostly all that we know, given the lack of an acknowledgement of who the translator was. The Dutch story gives us more meat to chew on, and so that perhaps is more interesting to talk about at some length. The Dutch translation was not commissioned by the New York legislature, where there was a significant Dutch-speaking population, but by the Federal Committee of New York, which was advocating for the ratification of the Constitution in New York. The translator was a Dutch minister, Lambertus Durand, who was born in the Netherlands. And for our purposes, the two most interesting things about him are that, one, he was not a lawyer. There's no evidence that he had a particular knowledge of the law either in the Netherlands or in the United States. He also, although he wrote in English a great amount, was quite humble about his skill in the English language, and in two of his books on theology, he criticized his own ability to make arguments and to use rhetorical flourish in the English language, which might have been humility, but also might indicate a certain lack of facility with the English language that may come out in his translations in terms of how he understood what the English language of the Constitution was saying. That may all be fairly historically interesting, but the question that we all in this room want to know is, can we learn anything about the Constitution as we have to understand and interpret it from looking at these translations made by two individuals without any particular, or at least probably without any particular connection to how it was written? And that answer turns on whether we can understand those translations as interpretations or as analyses of the original text. In some sense, the most bang for our buck that we can get is to understand these translations as explications of the meaning of the Constitution as understood by the two translators. So this is not so much looking at the way the translations read to the German and Dutch-speaking populations of Pennsylvania and New York, but looking at what they tell us about what two members of the original public, if you will, understood the Constitution to mean. So can translations be seen as interpretations or analysis? And that answer is yes. In language, there isn't between languages, there's not usually a one-to-one correlation of one word in one language automatically and rotely becoming a word in another language. The translator is always making interpretive choices about what to emphasize or what meaning to take from a word when there's multiple options, and that is never more clear than when we look at the translation of the word commerce in the German Constitution. There are maybe 5 or so words that the German translator could have plausibly picked that gave a variety of degrees of breadth to the meaning of commerce, everything from the acts primarily of buying and selling to the very broad idea of having commerce with, of having relationships with others. And the choice in that case was fairly narrow. right? So so the choices that the translators make act as their interpretations of what the text means. And the translations are not merely a source of interpretive value or of analytic value, but in fact a new kind of source. In some sense, we could just say these are like other secondary sources, like the Federalist Papers, like pamphlets, like speeches that try to explain what the Constitution stated. It's as though perhaps you had asked Durand and the German translator to restate in your own words what you think the Constitution means. But beyond merely being a source, it has a quality that other kinds of sources don't have, namely that the translations are both comprehensive sources. They translate every single word. They restate every phrase and every clause, even the ones that may be uninteresting or uncontroversial. And each of the words that are translated in context. So our other source for a truly comprehensive source of meaning or explication of all the words in the Constitution would be a dictionary. But in that case, we see the words out of context. We don't necessarily know if that's the meaning that one would have taken reading the Constitution just because we're seeing it in a dictionary. So the benefit of the translations is that we get an explication of the entire document, and we get that explication in the context of the document, all read together. That's not to say that there are not some pretty serious problems with trying to use the translations as a source of original meaning or any meaning. Because they are they're shallow in that they merely restate, they pick one way to restate a phrase or a word, and they don't explain why the person has chosen that view or chosen that word. They don't give a lot of depth or context to those choices. And, for lack of a more academic way of putting it, there are plenty of things that we would very plainly say are errors in the Constitution or in the translations of the Constitution, points where it's quite clear that the sentence does not make grammatical sense in the target language, something is misspelled or misphrased, where it's just fairly clear that there is not a plausible reading in which that was the way that the translator was thinking about what the sentence in English meant. But despite these problems, they represent a really significant source of original public meaning because they are a quite literal restatement of the entire Constitution by members of the original public. So let's dive into what those texts actually say. And before going into that, one cannot disclaim enough how not authoritative the statements are about what the German and Dutch translations mean for a variety of reasons. One, the primary goal of this paper was to take these documents, which have really lingered unnoticed for over 200 years, and make them accessible and relevant to the world today. And so the goal is mainly to give a light treatment of many of the clauses so that future people working in these areas can take them and kind of go forward. And the cost of that breadth is in some ways a lack of depth. But very quickly, the translations are quite metaphrasing instead of paraphrasing. They go almost word for word very closely with the original English text, except in the cases where they really don't. In many cases, they stick quite closely with the dominant academic or current legal understanding of what the words mean. For example, the Progress Clause. It's not at all clear what science and useful arts means. Knowledge and trades is the common understanding, and that comes out perfectly in both the Dutch and the German translations. But to the extent a theme emerges, the theme is that the translators, and presumably the educated public, tended to hold a wide variety of views about what the Constitution meant, and we see this most prominently, but not exclusively, in the translations of terms of art. So in the necessary and proper clause, I'm going to go through them a few of these very quickly. The Dutch translation roughly translates to necessary and capable of achieving the end sought. The German bizarrely translates to necessary and required, which is particularly perplexing given that there was an existing German phrase that the translator could have chosen that roughly means necessary and using a proportionally appropriate amount of power. which is one word in German, of course. For felony, the German text gets at the idea of a main or an important crime. But in Dutch, even though felony was quite clearly broader than this at the time in England and America, we get a very precise translation of crime worthy of death. And for the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors, in the German, we do get capturing the idea that high means your superior, high means the government. It's a crime against the king. It's a crime against the government, as opposed to a serious crime. In Dutch, Durand very clearly translates the phrase to serious crimes, not high crimes. Not a crime against the government, but one of great of significance. And this is where perhaps the most concrete takeaway from the project is, rather than merely being fodder for future research. So while in the case of high crimes, there's both a plausible common meaning and and the legal meaning that we tend to understand it to have. And one of the suggestions as to how to understand how terms of arts and legal words played in the public was to say that the average person would have known it was a term of art and kind of deferred judgment about what it meant to a lawyer. And while this is most strongly appearing in the serious crimes case, you could see it in the other terms of art as well. There's some indication here that that's not what always happened. That Durand, at a minimum, takes a cut at something that seems like a plausible understanding, which turns out to be just simply wrong if we believe that the legal understanding is the correct one. And that factually might undercut a couple claims about how to do original interpretation. And that's where I'm going to stop.